All right, everybody, welcome back to Tech in Asia's Product Development Conference 2022. For this next session, we have a keynote presentation from JX Lai, Chief Product Officer at Endows. He'll be talking about the framework for product strategy to find hidden needs, so like unknown unknowns, very important. There will be a Q&A after his presentation, so if at any point you have any questions, feel free to type them in. We'll get to them when he's finished with his presentation. JX, are you ready?
Yes.
All right, JX, stage is yours, man.
Cool. Okay. Strategy, but I'll get into more of that in a bit. But before that, maybe I thought I can just introduce myself very quickly. I'm JX. I'm currently the Chief Product Officer at Endows. And just a little bit about myself, I actually started my career at Dropbox in SF. At Dropbox, the first product I worked on was Dropbox Paper, which was a really interesting product because that was, I think, it really honed in terms of like trying to find, what can Dropbox Paper provide. And this is before when we had Notion and we had all of these other word editors that were coming out. And there's a surprising twist at the end for Dropbox Paper, which I will share a quick story at the end of the presentation. After Dropbox, I joined Lyft. At Lyft, I was mostly working on driver incentives. Thinking about all of these different surface areas, how all of these numbers, all this information need to tie and sort of tell a story together. And so, with the introductions out of the way, I just want to jump in today to talk about what is a product development strategy. The key point that I want to share with everyone today is I want to share a tactical guide on how product leads can define the product development strategy for their team. And I just want to highlight sort of three parts in the key sharing today. This will be a tactical guide, so feel free to take screenshots as you go along the way. There'll be 4 phases of product development. The product development strategy is a plan for product development that will help us build a solution that will solve your biggest problem. And as always, it always starts with problems. And then the third pillar to define is the team. For team, I think this is largely catered to PMs. So shout out to all PMs in the crowd here, and how you can lead, by influence and not authority, as we all know, a cross-functional team of engineering, design, and data scientists. And so with that, let's just jump into an overview of the product development process. So there will be 4 phases of product development. Phase 1 is centered around the problem review, thinking about what the problem is and how to define the problem and how we convince if that is the right problem to solve. In phase two, we'll go on to a solution space review, and I'll talk more about this. But the solution space is really about coming up with solutions and not really defining it yet. And then phase three is when we actually have an actual review. Oh, I think there's a typo over there. I think it's about solution details, the solution detail review, and then in phase four, we'll go through a launch review. And for each phase, as I mentioned, we'll talk about questions to be answered, what are the exit criteria, and who are the drivers. And so in phase one, a problem review, I think this is sort of the most important thing that we want to be answering today. Anytime we sit in front and as PMs, we think about, hey, what's a strategy in solving it? So like, how should we even go about convincing people, or how should we even go about thinking about what to build? It always starts with what's the problem we're solving and for whom. I think what's really important about this is that, how do we uncover problems? Usually we have a hypothesis. Sometimes it comes through user research, but the most important thing is always to start with what is the problem that we're solving. And after that, the next most important question is this problem worth solving? There are many problems that a product can face. For example, in the Endaos app, you could open it and it takes, for example, 50 milliseconds to load instead of 10 milliseconds. That could be a problem, but is that worth solving? And is it worth solving now? And this worth solving and why now are really important questions, because once we define one and two, then we want to go on to the next set, which is, are there an adjacent problem that we're not solving that we should be solving instead? And so this ensures that we're not going down the wrong tree, right? And so once we answer this, and I won't go through the entire list, but I've highlighted in bold the questions that I think are more relevant, including how do we break it down and how does it contribute to company OKRs. But it's really about defining what is the problem in the most crisp way as possible. And you know that you have the problem when you go through a review with approval from the product engineering and design leadership team. And so in all of the companies you work at, usually we have a head of product, head of engineering, head of design. It's important for all three to sort of come together. What I've seen happen in a lot of companies is that sort of like product makes a decision and then just push through, or engineering makes a decision and push through. But I think it's really important to have sort of this three parties, because everyone needs to be involved to get that approval. And because the problem is so important to be working on the right problem, then we might also want to involve members from the senior leadership team so that we can invite them and listen in. And I think this is actually the only stage that the senior leadership team will be involved, because this just tells you the importance of that. And so in terms of the driver, I think the PM should own the review. And by owning a review, I mean putting together all of the information, whether it's slides or a document, defining a problem. You can ask for help, but I think it's on the PMs itself. And then it's ideal for a lot of the team to be there, because if you're aligned on a problem, the solution will come. But if you're not aligned on a problem, I think that's where it gets hairy and confusing really, really quickly. And so now then we move on to the second phase of the product development process, which is the solution space review. After you've defined a problem, then what's really important before you go through that review is always to recap what the problem is, including any nuances. So an example of a problem that you might want to recap and make sure that it's nuanced enough is that, the problem could be like, hey, like just take a common everyday example, like where do I want to live? How far away do I want to live from, like, say, a subway station, a train station, or a bus station? Right? Like that's the problem, but it's not nuanced enough, because the priority of the problem is that maybe a P0, the highest priority is that I need a subway station that is within 10 minutes walking distance. Whereas a solution that says that I want to live within a subway station within 5 minutes walking distance is actually a P1, because that's considered a luxury. And so I think the idea is that it's not just about the problem, but the nuances within it. And after we've recapped and everyone has agreed on that, and it's good to just spend some time talking about it to make sure everyone's like, really, really clear on what that is. Then we go about, is there anything new we've learned about the problem since phase one? A lot of us are in high growth companies with rapid iterations that keeps moving and moving. And so it's really important to not have the problem be sort of a state in time, but we might learn something more. Maybe since then, we're looking at a problem of onboarding. Maybe it's not a problem anymore, or maybe it's getting better. I think that influences that. And again, we want to repeat the question. Are there some sub-problems that we'll address first before others? And this is part of sort of breaking it down. So I think that the idea here is, Once we have defined a problem, we can then start thinking about what are the different ways to solve it? What are the different ideas we have for solutions? And the very important thing about thinking about solutions is that it's always great to have a hypothesis about what can be a solution before we come up with it. So, every time there's a problem, it's very easy to just say, hey, why don't we solve it by X, Y, Z? But I think having a key hypothesis there is really, really helpful. And so before we wrap up this, I think that as we come up with sort of different possibilities for solutions, it's really important at this point in time to flag out what are the risks and dependencies that would exist as you attempt this solution. And what we should focus on is implementation risk. And the reason why is because before we go deep into a solution, and as PMs, we know that once we find a solution, the solution or description is just like the tip of the iceberg. There are all of these things that we need to go into detail to research to figure out. And before we go down that train, we just want to get a sense, is there any dependencies such that this is a great solution, but because it's so dependent on so many other things, by the time everything is done, it will take 6 months, it's not worth it. So that's a great thing to call out before we continue. And so the exit criteria is that we will review this phase, we will complete it with approval from the product engineering and design team. Senior leadership team might or might not, I think, use your discretion here, but in the same way, the PM's own a review, and then the other teams, you want them to be consulted on the solution space before the review. So the idea here is that between phase 1, which is the problem review, and phase 2, which is the solutions-based review, is where we work with the teams to come up with that before we make a presentation. And then once that is done, then we move on to phase 3, which is detailing the solution. So it is at this point in time where actually the most work is required, because it's really like the entire product engineering and designers need to come together. And, other than going through the recap and say anything new that we've always asked that I went through before, I think that you need to really get down to what are the details of the solution that would help people grok and get a sense of it. So if you're looking for feedback from the review, just UX feedback, then it can be lo-fi mockups, right? But if you really want very detailed feedback, then it needs to be wireframes, or UI stuff that has been more thought through. A really important question to ask at this point in time is user research needed or completed? And is it a blocker to execution? So user research is sort of like tricky in itself, because the thing is that should you be doing user research before, or should you be doing user research after? I think the way we should think about user research here is that it should give us more confidence in going ahead with this solution. So if we have an idea, we should come up with a mock-up, get it out in the market. But not every user research needs to be a blocker. Some user research can be structured as an enhancement, but there's some that is like, okay, I'm trying to introduce this new screen to explain this process, and if 5 out of 10 clients don't understand it, then that's not going to work. So then that will be a blocker. Included in this solution detail review, it also includes the expected engineering effort. So it should be an all-in-one thing, which is why EPD, everyone needs to be involved. All 3 parts, needs to come together. And then after we've come together, I think that a really, really important question to ask is, can we launch it sequentially? Can we phase it? What's the MVP? And can we experiment with that? Can we get a sense so that we can do it easily? I think all of these just de-risks the rollout, And once we have that and we define the success criteria, I think that will let us, make sure that we finish this review. And I think that in this case, usually it makes sense for the product designer to own a review, because on the product design side, they put together all the mocks, they put together all of the other experiences together, and then we can come together on that. And I think that the last part very quickly is the launch review. And on the launch review, it's after we have launched, we just want to come together to review how that went. Launch reviews can vary widely. It can be a really big bang rollout with PR and press and everything, or it could be a really small thing. But again, we recap what's the problem, what's the solution we came up with, how we did against our success criteria, and then are there new problems with that, and what are the next steps. And I think that this would sort of be the most straightforward thing, whereby we again have it with the product engineering and design team, and the PM should own it, and then we want to talk to analytics and the rest of the team to go through that together. So before I wrap up, I think that really like the way we think about this framework and this process is that many people think about finding hidden needs as like magic or like a secret sauce kind of thing. I think that the important thing to recognize is that it's the process that's really important. It's the discipline. If all of us, before we build anything, and sort of go through this product development process, I think what's really, really helpful is that this product development process would help us to dial in. And it's in going through this multiple times that we would hone our skills in developing and finding out what the problems are. And then the hidden problems would then, sort of surface itself. So, one thing to note, like all the problems enter this process once they've been identified and framed through the research process. One thing to call out is that not everything has to go through this. If you feel it's low importance and you can just make a decision, go for it. But the moment you start implementing and you realize that, why don't I have buy-in, or this feels really, really tough, people are not really coming behind that, then I think that it's a good time to come back and explore this process again. My practice is I like to keep all these reviews in public, including all of the notes. And as always, I think understanding a problem is like most of the work. The more we can understand what the problems are, the better we can do our job. And so with all of that, I mentioned about a story just now about Dropbox Paper. And what was really interesting is that when we worked on Dropbox Paper, at the time, like, products like Notion was like nothing, right? They had way less resources than anything. But I think the learning on the other side is that what the Notion team did really, really, really well was that they had this strict product development process and they focused really on the problems. And if you look at it right now, the tables have turned, right? Notion is such a great product. It's one of the most popular products. And I think that's because they've been really, really disciplined at ironing out, hey, this is a list of 100 problems you want to solve. And how do you go through this, to uncover all of that? So, yeah. I think with that, I think I'll hand it over to Winston to guide us through our Q&A.
All right. Thank you so much, JX. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I think we all of us learned a lot today. I just wanted to go a little bit deeper into the the first part of it. Right. Just can you take us through a little bit more again through the the tactical guide, product development strategy, and the team the sections of this. The whole strategy of that at the start there.
Sure. So I think that what I mentioned there is that the three parts, right, of what we're going to share today. The tactical guide was basically around the four things that we're going to go through: identifying the problem, trying to figure out what the solution space is, having a review to decide and commit to the solution, and then having a launch plan. So I think that's a tactical guide. I think the second part of that was, other than technical guide, to define what is this product development or product strategy process. And I think it's really this process of walking through it, knowing when to enter it, knowing when not to enter it. And then the last part on the team is really on who needs to be involved in every single part of the way, which we have detailed out in those four parts. It's mostly PM-led, but I think that in the third phase of this detailed solution, that should be design-led. And then we come together with other parts of the leadership team.
Right. Okay. No, thank you for that answer because it's very comprehensive, right? We're taking into consideration things to do as well as the people to involve. Sometimes we might forget the second part, all right. So let's go into questions from the audience, from the floor. We have quite a few. First up is Jonathan Sito, right? He asks, how do you approach picking which problems to solve? In other words, determining when it's the right time to solve for a particular problem.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. That's a great question. I think that picking the problem to solve is like the most important thing. And so I like that, you're prefacing it with like, it's not just about picking a problem. I think that when we look at problems, there are two dimensions that we need to look at. We have a problem. The dimension is how painful it is and how painful it is now, right? Because there's the time element to it, which you rightly pointed out, but there's also how much pain it actually is. I think the way to decide on what problems to solve is that it depends on the stage and the size of the company. I think the smaller the company is, there should be few decision makers. So for example, if a company is 10 people, the first product manager is usually the CEO, and you hire a first PM when the team is at maybe like 10 to 15. At that stage, it's the CEO or PM who decides. And I think it's really about going out, talking to users, getting a sense. We can optimize it for different ways, but usually we want to optimize it for impact. And usually at the start, it's all about growth. So usually I would say the biggest problems at the start is about finding product market fit. After that, and product market is basically what sticks, right? And after that, you then move into mostly it's around onboarding. because it's about scaling, and so most of the biggest problems is that how do you get people through the funnel, how do you get people on board. So product market fit, onboarding, and then the third stage is really about convergence in terms of whether it's subscriptions or how do you get people to pay after they're being active users. So I think that these are sort of the three main buckets, and usually it's around finding what will be most impactful to getting product market fit, what is the most impactful to driving onboarding, what is the most impactful to driving conversions, that will determine what problems to solve. If you are ever in doubt about the problem to solve, I think I would just encourage everyone, just pick up the phone and call you and just ask them, hey, if I solve this, what will happen?
All right. Okay. So on that note, right, on like figuring things out on the market and so on, internally, Fitri Fauzia is asking, how do, according to your experience, how do you define a robust yet feasible OKRs for new products which don't actually exist in the market just yet?
Yeah. Um, the way I think about OKRs is that there are two main types of OKRs. The first type of OKRs, and people, some people have an opinion on that. The first type of OKRs is actually to ship. Some people say that, hey, shipping is not good enough. Why? Because if you're shipping, you're just doing it for the sake of doing it, right? So, but that's the shipping part of OKR. And then there's the measuring part of OKR. So for a new product that has not existed in the market yet, as I mentioned, your main goal is product market fit. And how do you define product market fit? I think that the easiest way to define product market fit is retention. And it depends. For a social app, like I worked on a music app, our metric is a 1 day retention and a 7 day retention. And that was because it's an investing app, it's more long term. We think about it as what is the average time it takes for someone to fund their account, which is a sort of very different but another play, because if you don't fund it, then obviously you're not there. But the idea here is that I think that what I want to stress is that when we define OKRs and it's a new product, the most important thing to try to define is your baseline. So in those two examples that I shared, in this example, when it's about, okay, I want to ship this and I want to find product market fit and I want to find retention, every new feature, every new product, it's what is my baseline. So I know that, okay, my baseline 1 day retention is really shitty, 3%, but it's great. The next time I ship that, how do I move that forward? That establishment of a baseline for a new product is really important because that sets the stage for next phases. Same thing, my baseline, I'm going to launch this feature that will attempt to decrease the time it takes for people to fund their account, if any. The problem is that I don't even know if they're funding it anyway. And so the baseline is that, okay, I know that of 100 people that sign up, maybe 10 people will fund it within a month. So with that baseline, I can then think about, okay, what is it that is causing them, and then, sort of iterate on that. So just to summarize that, two types of OKR. Shipping OKR is not that bad, especially the earlier stage you are. And then the second part is about scaling it, and then about what is the baseline for this new product.
Okay. All right. So this next question is a little bit more from the business point of view here, right?
Okay.
Barira would like to ask, as a business analyst, right, how should the product idea be proposed to management and developers so that everyone's in line and convinced on the vision?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is not just as a business analyst, this is for everyone, right? Everyone should be thinking about what are the product ideas that we can. And if you're thinking about it, that's also a good sign because it means that your company is product driven. The way to do that and how we can propose to management, usually I think that the best way to do it is in writing it out. Amazon is famous for having all of their reviews done not using slides, but writing out, a 6-pager. I think that the best way to do that is actually to write out your product idea, and it can be very simple. You can start with a 5W: who, what, when, what, why, and have all of that and lay it out. And the reason why writing is important is because it structures your thoughts and it helps you to become a better business analyst, PM, whatever. When you can structure that, it is really, really easy to just put that forward and then share it with someone and then say, hey, I wrote this up. Do you mind taking a read through it? And then I can walk you through it if needed, especially the higher you go. So the idea here is also to be tactical, right? Is your product idea very dependent on engineering or very dependent on management buy-in? For example, if it's a quick hack or a quick change, go and talk to the engineers, right? And then work for that. Maybe it doesn't even have to be a doc, it can be a Slack thread. If it's to management, then I think it's a bit different because where in management and how do you want to spike? Is it from a marketing angle? Is it a product angle? But the idea is that if you sit down and write it out, you would never go wrong with that.
Okay. All right. The next question is something that is it's a bit harder to measure, and that's why people are asking. Adrian from Noteflare is asking, how do you measure changes that aren't so tangible? Example, user trust in $10.
That's a great question. Trust is the lifeblood of any business. The thing is that not everything can be measured. And here's an example, right? I think that one of the most fun things that any PMs or designers and anyone like to do is to redesign an app. The problem of redesigning an app is, how do you measure it? I can tell you, in my experience, most redesigns won't give you an immediate uplift. Right? It's not like I launched a redesign and suddenly see, oh, I have more clients or my conversion rates are through the roof. No, that never happens. In fact, most redesigns actually start off with a dip because people are not used to the new stuff and they take time to get used to a new thing, right? For example, I'm so used to sharing a file at Dropbox by clicking right click and click on share. If you were to change that flow, that would be very, very challenging. Now, the thing though is this: most redesigns are not impactful in the short term, but it's the type of things that will be very impactful over the long term because it gets rid of any product and design debt. So if you say that, oh, a redesign won't move short term, so I won't do it, you'll end up finding yourself in a situation where in the long term, you will be saddled with so much product debt that you cannot continue going on. So I think the trust thing is interesting because it's like, it's not just about measuring in a short term and long term. I think we have to have a view. I think that there are very traditional ways of doing it. For example, there are many, many survey companies that you can ask to go and ask them, hey, what's your sentiment on Endowus? And then when you ask that, don't ask them about your sentiment on Endowus alone, but pick a few competitors and do it over time, right? Is that sentiment going up or down? So Endowus's case, it will be the other robo advisors and will be the banks, and we can do it, every 6 monthly and see how that changes. But again, I think that is sort of like a very cursory kind of thing. So the way to think about trust is, it's like, and this is pretty unconventional. Maybe the way to think about it is that, what am I doing to gain trust? That is hard to measure. But what am I doing not to lose trust is easier to measure. So if I take the opposite, which is, okay, how do I not lose trust? I bring up my NPS scores. Is it going up or is it going down? Are clients leaving? Are people not getting retained? I think that might be a easier way in the short term to measure how am I doing on sort of more fuzzy items like that.
Okay. So you did mention earlier about who to bring in at what point of time to work on what thing. So the team factor of it.
Sure.
There is a question here from Ali Reza. Apparently, I guess from a very very small team because they ask, this process very interesting. However, it seems to apply to established teams and organizational charts. How would you go about doing this for a team of two? One person on the back end, one person on the front end.
Yeah, that's a great question. If that's the case, LFG, man, let's freaking go. I think that the reason that we need a product development process is when your company comes to a certain scale whereby you would need to have that alignment and have that thoughtfulness because resources are conserved. But if you're a very small team of two, now the question is, are you a small team of two alone trying to start something, or are you a small team of two within the context of a larger company? If you're a small team alone, then just go for it because you're trying to find product market fit. It's just about shipping, it's just about velocity. Just go for it, right? Don't waste your time in doing any of that. If you are a team of two in a larger company, then this might still be important because you don't want people to be questioning, what the heck are these two folks doing, right? You don't want people questioning that, hey, these people are just like in La La Land doing their own stuff. That's where it's really important to then bring them through and show that, hey, we've got through this process, this rigorous process of making sure that we're solving the right problem.
Okay. There's the next question on a bit of a similar note. First part of the question is that, do you have any recommendations or success cases for timelines to cycle through the phases that you talked about? And does it differ based on company size or like the growth phase?
Yeah, okay. So this is a really interesting really interesting thing because the question is really about what is the time between four of these, right? And any extreme answers would kill you. If you take too long and you are too thoughtful and you take, like, for example, a month each, hey, dude, that's like nuts. You're never going to ship anything. At the same time, if you're rushing to it and say, hey, let's just do it in daily sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, you don't have time to let ideas ferment. I think that the way you should measure this is that in your current setup, in your current company, you should get a sense, how long does it take for us to go from ideation of a solution or a problem to shipping it, right? Take that baseline and then go through this product development cycle using that baseline first and see if it naturally reduces that, and then use that as your new baseline. So I don't think there's any magic formula for that. It depends on how big the problem is, it depends on how complicated the solution is, but I think that the idea is to try to have this rigor and see how it impacts your company.
All right. Okay. Young Youth is asking, when you have some critical problems when designing the solution itself,
Sure.
What technique do you use to prioritize the issues to solve when you're designing the solution from your experience?
Sure. Um, every time I think about um, a solution, I think about it in two axes. One is, does it work? And two is, do people care? So that's sort of the underwriting thing of what I think when we come up with a solution. Now, the thing is this, right? It could be that crap, like, oh, we're stuck. Like, how do you get about doing this? Usually, when that happens, it could be one of three things that's happening. Number one, the problem is not clear enough. And so you're spinning around in solution space, right? So if the problem is not clear enough, then I think we need to go back and figure out what that problem is. Okay. Now, the second thing that we need to think about is that maybe the problem is very, very, very clear, but it could be that the problem is too big, right? So then the thing is that we need to then start to break down that problem. So the problem is very clear, but it's too big. So how can we break it down, right? After we break it down, the third way to think about a solution is, okay, if I really don't know what it is, what can I do to just try and test and learn? Because done is better than perfect. The problem is a lot of times when we try and design solutions, like we try and find what is the perfect solution, but all we need to do is just like, hey, let's just get something out and try it.
Yeah, I think on that note, that's a very practical note to end this session on. Thank you so much, Jax, for being with us, answering all these questions. Thank you so much to the audience. That unfortunately we couldn't get through every single question, but I'm sure if you reach out to him on LinkedIn or on this platform, he'd be quite happy to answer them. Yeah, So thanks, Jax.
All right, thank you. Bye.
All right, so audience members, we are going to be taking a little break now, a half-hour break. Take the time to get a little bit of food, get a little coffee maybe, and then we can proceed to the second half of day one. All right.